of, we're going to bring in people that we know, and that's how we're going to populate our organizations. That's how we know, for lack of a better word, where they came from. What became apparent as time went on was that what those policies really did was exclude populations. And so in a way, when we were using those terms about how we would include people, and women specifically, what we didn't recognize maybe, or maybe didn't admit, was that there was some exclusionary purpose behind that. And so, you know, in today's world, what became obvious for me, I was a fraternity and sorority affairs advisor on a campus for 10 years. And my sorority had never used letters of reference or reference letters. And then everybody's talking about these reference letters. And I'm like, well, who's writing them? And then people would ask me to get somebody else to write a letter. And I'm like, they don't even know her. And so all of these complications started coming about. And I was like, okay, so what's the real purpose? And so that's kind of just to give us a little bit of a lead in to say, you know, maybe we just took it for granted. These were the practices that some of our organizations had taken on. And why has that, or has that needed to change? You know, I think at the end of the day, reference letters and legacy policies throughout time, at the beginning of our experience, were really to keep Black women out of our organizations, and it was to keep us very white in some scenarios. And so as our populations have changed, as our intentions have changed, what is that? What are your experiences with that? I just wanted to kind of lay a foundation a little bit for us to know why this topic is so such an important topic at this point too.
Thanks, Miriam.
I'm just seeing pictures and names. I'm not seeing any people.
I know it's hard if people are at work. Some computers don't have cameras and stuff like that. So feel free to jump into the conversation at any point in time.
I was gonna say, I know some of these people, they have some thoughts for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm happy to share. I'm Nikki. Hey, everyone. Hey. Super excited to be here. Thanks for the invite. I think for the legacy policies in particular, it hasn't really come to the forefront until like the past 6 months or so, which I just find fascinating. And by the forefront, I mean like in mainstream conversation, particularly with a lot of our national groups. I think there's been some campus-based advisors and students at the local level for quite some time saying that this is not really what we want, or we don't really understand what our policy is or how to work with it or why we have it. So I just find it so interesting that over the past 6 months or so, given the uprising of racial injustice in America, that this is coming to the forefront. For me, while I've appreciated a lot of folks bringing this conversation up, from a national level, it seems a little performative in why we're maybe abolishing them or getting rid of them. But I also recognize that the intent is there to try to change some of the environments that we have and some of the policies that we have to try to remove some of those barriers. I think for a lot of our members, particularly in Delta Phi Epsilon, which I'm a member of, a lot of our members were calling for the abolishment of our policy right after Delta Gamma released the statement that their policy was no longer. And it was so fascinating because a majority of our members didn't actually know what our legacy policy was. They just knew that we had one, and that we needed to get rid of it or else we were racist if we still had it. So there was some education in terms of like what our policy is and how it can benefit, but also how it might harm. And that was really helpful for our membership. I don't think it changed a lot of perspectives in terms of whether or not we should have it. But just wanted to kind of share my thoughts in terms of seeing some of those pieces from a national landscape as someone who has, advocated for the going away of these policies for about 4 or 5 years now. It's amazing what a few people in power can do to make some things move really quickly in a time where people feel like they need to act.
Well, and Nikki, what's interesting to me is that, you know, I was a fraternity sorority affairs advisor on a campus from 1991 to 2001. I mean, these people weren't even born then, most of them. And so, you know, what's interesting to me is I think that we convinced ourselves that this was respect, right, for our alumni. It was respect to allow their daughters, granddaughters, whoever in. And then as time changed, I don't really think collegians cared. Like, to say that they're a legacy, in some ways, the legacies became a bigger hassle because they were a challenge because they thought they knew everything. And then in some of the chapters, like really big national organizations, there are more women who are legacies than the number of women they can accept because of quota total, quota range, right? And so many of the collegians today are like, they don't care about the policies, but it still means something to alumni in some ways. So in some ways, I've seen the legacy policy over the last, like you're saying, I've asked for years, like, does it improve the relationship with our alumni, or does it just hurt it? Because I think it creates a false expectation that if you're a legacy, you get preferential treatment. And that hasn't really been on the chapter side for a long time in many situations, or in some situations, let's just say that.
Sure. Yeah. And I think, so in a lot of experiences in Delta Phi Epsilon, we have actually had a legacy who's not interested in joining. They want to join a different chapter on campus, and, you know, maybe they're just not clicking with members on campus, or they're just not interested in that chapter. So it's almost become this conversation of like, we're pinpointing the legacies that we have and figuring out why don't they want to be in D-Phi-E. And I've always questioned, like, while that might be a great thought process for us to have, we're talking about a minimized amount of people here. So to try to figure out where we can put our energy in places that can be beneficial for us to try to grow our membership, I think is also super important.
And we have, speaking from a smaller national organization perspective, Nikki, I definitely understand where you're coming from, where a legacy may not want to become a part of that particular chapter. And we have definitely, I think sometimes the women struggle with that. Like, why don't they like us? Like, you know, what's wrong with us, kind of deal. But we have really tried to express with our women even that it is about finding their own home and making sure that they're feeling comfortable too. And chapters change, especially, you know, for our engaged alumni and our moms that are out there. They may have had a very different collegiate experience than where their chapter is at now. So really trying to get our collegians to understand that, I think has been one of the, I don't want to say struggles, but one of the stronger educational aspects of working with collegiate chapters overall for me, from my own experience. I do have a question here that says, how can Panhellenic advisors stay up to date with chapter policies regarding legacy/reference letters? And can college Panhellenics edit their bylaws such that they are not considered, or do chapters just follow their national guidelines? So Panhellenically, it's a sovereign right for a particular organization to come up with their own policy, their own membership policies. So a Panhellenic can't necessarily take away the right of a particular organization to change anything, but what you can do as a Panhellenic advisor is make sure that you are in communication with a chapter advisor or somebody on an advisory board or some kind of board that works with the chapter involved alumni that asks the question, and maybe even get copies of their policies, their legacy policies, if there are policies, or bylaws, if they're able to share all of that information, or really just asking the question. I mean, putting it out there too would be my advice.
Well, and I think that on most campuses that the individual chapters are the ones who handle their legacy scenarios. So I don't know that the Panhellenic advisor or the Panhellenic Association would really get as involved with that. I think that it's really individual chapters, like Amanda said. That would be my thought.
Well, and I guess my question back maybe would be, do reference letters or have reference letters gone through fraternity sorority advisors that do get them involved in some way, shape, or form in that process? And I don't know, that may be a question that y'all can answer probably better than I've never been a fraternity sorority life advisor, so I don't know, but that may be part of the reason why also that.
I think there was an era of time when Panhellenic advisors or fraternity sorority life advisors did facilitate some of that. I think that's been a long time ago now. I think most of the organizations, that's facilitated by the individual organization. And it does become very confusing to potential new members, I think, especially those who haven't grown up in the sorority world, to understand why some organizations need them and some organizations don't. Does that mean that you become that they're more organized, or, that's a more special kind of experience? And, one of the things specifically with Tri Delta as reference letters, we used to have a requirement for that. And again, I'm a Theta Phi Alpha, but I work for Tri Delta. It used to be a national requirement. 2 summers ago at National Convention, coming from our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Task Force, our committee, no letters of recommendation being required by the national organization, that was voted to be changed. And so the national organization doesn't require them, because we'd have individual members just write them as a requirement. And now there are chapters who still require it. And those conversations have been, what do we do? Well, when the pandemic started, for example, people were like, well, we might need people to recommend, right? So Tri Delta opened up letters of reference letters if a chapter needed those, or if alumni wanted to engage in that way. Tri Deltas could write them. I could write one if a member needed one, and those young women could recommend themselves. And that was set up on the website as well. So it's a different way of thinking about it. And in some ways it is similar to a job application, right? Most of the time you need a reference, but I don't know that that is really what the purpose of them was about. And so I think it's, we got to go back to what was the purpose, and can we get that information in other ways?
Right. Elena actually shared a great comment saying, as mother of 2 Zeta daughters, it also puts a lot of pressure on the potential new member. They felt it would be that she would be hurt if they didn't get invited to the Zeta parties. Then they thought it would reflect on her as their mom. So it puts lots of pressure on the women from both ends of things. That's a great comment, Elena. Thanks so much. One of the other things that Marianne and I had briefly talked about, even this year with so many of our recruitment processes going virtual, and talking about letters of recommendation specifically, but there were some cases and some Panhellenics that gave potential new members the opportunity to submit a 30-second or 1-minute, 2-minute video of themselves to kind of introduce themselves, as a way to just say hello, this is what they're about, and instead of that face-to-face contact right away. So I thought that was interesting, and where does that kind of lead us even for the future, when we think about letters of recommendation and a virtual recruitment process. God knows where we're going to end up. We already know in the spring it's going to be like that, virtual. So years from now, is that going to continue to be a thing for women to introduce themselves through a video? And then do they become more of a production, like we've seen some of our chapters do for their, open house round videos? So it's just pretty interesting overall.
I'll just be honest. I don't see chapters laboring over reference letters, being like, oh my gosh, this random alumni member loves this woman. I mean, they are trolling social media to find out about this woman. And I think, you know, back in the day, we used to get a picture. Remember, I'm a little bit older than y'all are, but you had to put a picture, and so everybody started doing glamour shots, and they'd put their best pictures on it. And then I thought we got to a place where we were like, okay, let's look at a woman's character, right? Let's look at, then when I heard that they were doing videos, I'm like, what does that say? I mean, at the end of the day, you know, if we're going to really, and I think this is an amazing opportunity, this whole virtual thing I've been fascinated about. I actually was able to watch Amanda as a chapter advisor, you know, take her chapter through it from this end. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is so different. And so I think that the way we think about how women come to us needs to be different. I think that there needs to be more of a pipeline of how do we get to know people? How do we do like the junior league does, and we open up that I am going to be responsible for looking for somebody because I want those people have a lot to contribute. And I think that that's maybe where some of this is going to change. Unfortunately, our alumni and our organizations are still struggling with, what are the alumni going to say? And it's like, really? Because at the end of the day, I think we're struggling right now. I think we're struggling with relationships with our alumni because we lose them, right? I don't know that these two things are really reasons for them to stay engaged. I think some of them stay engaged or get back engaged when their children or their friends' children go to college and go through sorority recruitment. So how can we change that engagement process, I think is important.
Yeah.
I know we've said it, but.
And Nikki actually wrote, if organizations are going to keep the letter of recommendation, I think it would be a good idea to consider who that recommendation comes from. Agreed. A letter from a coach or a teacher would be so much more personal and ultimately helpful than a letter from a member that they barely know. And I think, again, coming from a smaller organization that we don't even look at letters of recommendation, and we have chapters that who literally find out that somebody is a legacy and they're like, nope, we don't want them. Do you know what I mean? Like, that's just the mentality that they come into recruitment with. And it's just interesting to kind of see it play out. But I 100% agree that having a letter come from somebody that somebody actually knows, that has worked with that person, whether it be in high school or on a college sport or junior league or whatever other outside organization they may have outside of high school, is going to mean so much more. And I don't know, like if it's a letter or a form letter, actually one of the, when we put out that we were going to be talking about this topic, I got an email from the president of the Chicago Panhellenic Alumni Association. And unfortunately, I don't think she's on this call today, but she was great in sharing, like, as the person who helps to organize that process in that area, it becomes very stressful for her as that person to try to navigate through all of that in order to make sure all of these different organizations at all of these different institutions get what they need for all of these potential new members. So I do think it's a pretty interesting concept. And I don't know, does it become a form letter? Does everybody use the same thing? Would all groups be open to that? Would that be another, policy that NPC would have to be put in place, that, or does that come directly from a Panhellenic? I'm not really sure. I don't know if anybody else has thoughts on that. It looks like.
Or maybe young women just take care of it themselves. I mean, I am married to my wife as a Tri Delta alumni initiate. And when people started asking her to write letters of reference, she was like, I don't even know these people, Marianne. Why would I do that? She goes, because then I feel like I'm putting my name on somebody I don't know, And so maybe we teach 18-year-olds who are going to be going off to college that if you need a letter of reference, a reference letter, maybe you figure out how to get those, because most of their parents are doing it for them. Mm-hmm. And so I guess I think that in some ways, I personally don't want MPC to have to implement another process. I guess I'm at the point of where I'm like, how can we teach women, young women, right, to go into this process as something that it's an investment where they are going to meet friends and make friends. And they're also going to learn some leadership development. Like, how do we phrase that differently so that these things aren't really, you know, maybe in a year, we won't even be talking about these things. Some organizations still are going to be, and that's okay. That's their business and their right. But can we get to the point of where we're really encouraging these women to use this as an opportunity to step into that adult space a little bit, as opposed to having it be done for them? Because then I think it completely defeats the purpose.
Absolutely.
And let alone how it affects, you know, our BIPOC women.
Yeah, absolutely. Elena actually wrote, as a retired educator, college admissions officers are doing away with recommendation letters. Rationale is that students would ask someone who'd give a favorable reference anyway. That's a really great point also, because I know as somebody who worked with the leadership consultants for my own organization, as well as working on a college campus where I have young professionals that are moving into different roles and serving as that reference check for them. I am always the person that's like, please come and ask and talk to me about that. Because if I get a call from somebody, it just happened to me 2 weeks ago, that they're like, oh, this person said that they should call you. They're applying for this. I was like, oh, that's interesting. I haven't talked to that person in 2 years. And they're like, oh, really? Can you still answer some questions? I'm like, sure, but like, I'm not sure where she's at right now. Like, I have no idea. So I'm pretty much honest with the person that calls me and asks, you know, if I can serve as a reference, I'll do it, but it doesn't always come out favorably for that person either. So it really just does depend. Laura just shared, I can share a lot as a former chapter advisor, past Panhellenic president, and current international officer. So yeah, you can share a lot of good information, but you never know somebody who may not be asking you for that information either. So,
well, I was actually, Amanda, before I became the Panhellenic president for San Antonio, so it's a huge city, not the size of Chicago, but still the same way. We actually do all of ours online. And so what they do is the girls, the potential new members will come, and if they want to sign up because of that, and I'm in Texas, so that makes a big difference on the letter of recommendations. It's not that they're saying that, it's more an introduction for the chapter to know the person, know the PNM a little better. One of the things you can do, but it also helps, like I know that a couple of times there was an alumni who, or an alumna, because it was one person, who had information about a potential new member that already was having issues of underage drinking and things like that. And another chapter took them, and so then they became a standards issue. So some of the times, you know, there's two sides to that, in a sense of, I get it, you want everybody to participate, but you also, if they're in the community, the PNM may not know they're an alum of a particular sorority as well. But what San Antonio does is they actually sign up online, and then wherever they're going to school, our person has, our master file is what we call Fern. She's incredible on that. It sends it out to every sorority that has a chapter on that campus. And Dr. Mack, we actually give it back to the girls so that they can go out and also become the adult and get that reference from them if they don't already know somebody in the chapter or in that sorority. So it kind of helps them actually grow up to, yeah, the mom does help sometimes, but we remind them, ask your teachers, ask somebody at your church, ask somebody else if they've ever been in a sorority, because then you're right, it's somebody who actually knows them that can write that letter. And it's like I just said, it's more an introduction. And I can tell you as a chapter advisor, it makes a big difference when we have one from an alum who knows the potential new member and can talk about what a great asset it is. Or some of the times there are people that are very shy. So the virtual one really did help the girls that are shy, right? That was the one thing that I loved about it. But those, if we go back to the way we did before, if someone isn't outgoing, then they may not do as well at some of the larger schools or larger houses, because they're one of those, they have to get to know them. So if an alum tells them that, then they might put somebody else to talk to them that would bring out what they, the qualities that everybody else sees. If that helps a little bit on those sides.
And
So,
Laura,
yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I was going to say, you know, Amanda and I had talked earlier. I think the reference letters, you're right, Texas, the South, you know, big schools. And I've heard, you know, chapters that I've worked with, they say, especially if they're on the fence about a young woman, then they'll go to that letter, and it is dependent. Or if she doesn't have a letter, it's an easy way to be able to remove her, if that makes any sense. So you're right. I think it's geographical. I think it's size of chapters. I would say larger chapters are still using them more than smaller chapters or private schools or, you know, that sort of thing. So I agree with you. That's a great point.
Yeah. Liz also wrote, just because we were talking about virtual recruitment earlier, saying that she believes that the virtual recruitment process can open up opportunities for women regarding cost, less pressure when it comes to outfits and the showiness factor that goes on, and they can actually be themselves.
Frills, it's called frills.
Same for chapters. And I think we saw that just overall in numbers wise. I think that you know, a lot of groups were very concerned that their numbers were going to go down this year, and we were concerned about that and what the financial implication was going to be for that, and that didn't necessarily work out that way for everybody the way that we thought that it would. So I definitely agree that you know, we're seeing more and more of that, and I think that's going to be very interesting for the future too.
Can I go off of that quick, Mandy and Marianne? I'm thinking about, like, I'm just thinking about first generation students that, because I'm a first generation student, and when I went through recruitment, I did not go through formal recruitment at St. John's University in Queens. I went through informal recruitment, and there was so little barriers of joining a sorority. Like, I was able to pick who I wanted to see and learn about. There were no cost involved with recruitment. I didn't have to, you know, fill out a Maraba, whatever the case is. Like, there was freedom around it, and I didn't feel like there were barriers there. And I'm looking at panel, and I don't advise Panhellenic anymore, but I did in my previous role, that there are a lot of barriers for women to join. And if they can't afford that cost, that impacts diversity, inclusion, and equity on our college campuses. So even in the letters of recommendation and the legacy policies. So I feel like if those don't get, if national organizations don't get rid of them, and Panhellenics don't, you know, start looking at cost, there's going to be a lot of, I think we're going to continue to struggle with diversity and inclusion in our Panhellenic communities.
And I would go off of that, Liz, and say, just as a plug for myself and Marianne, quite honestly, in what we've seen in recruitment, especially this year, and the barriers that have been there, and how a formalized recruitment process does impact our women, I think can be very negative. And when we talk about, when I looked at efficacy and the development of efficacy overall, and how a formalized Panhellenic sorority recruitment impacts the development of efficacy for women, going through both the potential new member and the collegiate member, it's not good. Right. And from both sides, from a lower recruiting strength chapter and a higher recruiting strength chapter. So overall, there's a lot of great information, if I do say so myself, just saying, that is out there that does back that up, because it is a lot of pressure. And having women go to places that they feel comfortable, and not having the pressure of going to places where they already know that they don't belong, and it's not their home, and it automatically excludes them from the process overall. Nikki also wrote, letters also contribute to bandwagon effect and affinity bias, which is something we need to get away from to help our chapter authentically grow. Retweet for the virtual process. I'm here for it. So I agree. Thank you, Nikki.
Well, and I believe that even if, when we go back to in person, I think that the students will ask for, I don't know what the advisors and the national organizations are going to do, but I think the students are going to ask for a part virtual experience. At least the students that I've talked to, that I've been on, you know, calls and presentations and different things. I think they liked it. And I think it was a mutual, it truly, you know, and as an advisor, I used to say, it's a mutual selection process. And that's because that's what I was told, right? And I think that is somewhat, yes. I think the process is more on the chapter side than it is on the new member side. But I think that it was a more personal experience. And I think it was a more mutually engaging process. And even the potential new members that I've talked to that are now members, they're like, we really liked it. Like, I got to know people. Now they want to be in person. I mean, they want to be with their people. But I think it gave them some even playing field. And what I hope that will do is that it will open up access to women, whether it's transgender students, whoever, that Siri's going to try to help me out now with my watch. But you know, I think no matter who it is, that those students will feel, those women will feel like, you know, I can be a part of this. And I think that this whole time period has given us some opportunities to think, is this the experience? You know, my supervisor said the other day, she said, somebody gave us $10 million and said, you can start an organization from 17 to the end of, you know, all ages and stages in life of life. How would you design that?
Ooh.
Wow.
That's a question for you.
What it looks like today. And I would venture to say, probably not. And that's not to say I don't value sorority. I value experience. I value the friendships. I value all of those things. But I think what this pandemic and the social, you know, racial reckoning and the times that we're in, the election, I think that it's all caused us I hope it's caused us to pause to say, is this really, are these the organizations we want to be a part of? I'm not real sure.
Yeah, for sure. And Liz wrote also, IFC men are really enjoying it also. So I know her IFC men are going through a virtual process as well. So just knowing her. Marianne, you had a question on legacy policies specifically.
Oh, it goes along conversations about, would a change in the legacy policy, in your opinions, would it help or assist you know, in creating more access for women of color and women who come from diverse backgrounds? What are your thoughts? Whether it's legacy policies or letters of reference. Laura, you had said something earlier. What are your thoughts about being from a big area?
Dr. Mack, repeat, what was the question on the thoughts?
No, I'm just, do you think that a change in legacy policies or recruitment, you know, reference, do you think that it would assist with creating more access for women of color or our BIPOC, you know, BIWOC women or members? Do you think that that would have an impact? Like you said, you're in Texas, so that's a whole, that's different conversations maybe, but.
Well, I think it would a little bit in that sense of what they were talking, one was talking about earlier, when you, like, my girls went through, and I don't know whether it was a blessing or not, they actually chose a college that didn't have my chapter, which was almost, well, it really literally took the pressure off both of us. Well, in that sense of, you know what, they'll fit where they shine the best, where they feel at home, and they don't have to have that extra pressure of, oh my gosh, you know, she's there, and, you know, I was involved with Panhellenic at the time for them. And I think it does kind of help, just because it takes a little bit of that pressure away from that legacy policy. And like some of you said, some of the times there are certain schools that they actually don't even list, the girl doesn't want to list that she's a legacy, because she feels that it won't enhance her process. It will actually limit her a lot of the times. So like you said, one of the times, I think, I can't remember who said it, but it was like, you go through and they go, oh my gosh, I didn't even know she was a legacy. Well, that's on purpose for that reason. So I think it helps either way. I think it just depends on if the girl, I mean, I think part of it is that it will open it up, because it will allow more opportunities for other people as well. I think so.
Yeah, absolutely. Other people.
think for a lot of people, we tend to think about the people who we are closest to or the people that we interact with the most. And for a majority of people in our country, I would say that our friend groups or our people that are closest to us, our trust circle, however you want to phrase it, are pretty homogeneous to us. Like they share a lot of the same social identities that we do. You know, their race is probably the same, their sexual orientation is probably the same, their socioeconomic status is probably the same. And if we are trying to open our organizations to truly being inclusive and more accessible to people, I think oftentimes when we ask someone who doesn't hold a majority identity to get a letter of recommendation, we are asking them to go extremely outside their comfort zone to try to find someone who they might not associate with or have in their close friend group. So I think that by kind of eliminating that barrier, it can do a couple of things. I think first and foremost, it can make the process feel like it's more accessible. Whether or not it actually is, I think is a chicken before the egg conversation for another day. But ultimately, if we are in a space where a woman who is thinking that she wants to go through the process but doesn't really know a lot about the experience as a first generation college student, or maybe she's second gen, but no one in her family was in a sorority or a fraternity or whatever, she has kind of that option to say, okay, cool, let me test the waters and figure this out, as opposed to saying, oh, here are all the things I have to do and navigate in order to do this. So I think a lot of times when there are a lot of parameters put on things, humans in general are like, hey, I don't know about this, let me think twice. Which I think can be a good or bad thing depending on how you look at it. But ultimately, I think we as human beings need to come to the Allah, Jesus, Buddha moment, whatever you want to call it, that we are not as diverse on our inner circles as we think we are. And we are not we may be accepting people and say we accept people for who they are and all of these pieces, but our inner circles and people who we would go to ask for letters of recommendation or to ask for important questions or advice or things are not people who are much different than us. So if that's the case, we are probably continuing to write letters and give recommendations and references to people who are very similar to us. So for me, being a white, heterosexual, cis, middle-class woman, that is probably who I am most likely to give a letter of recommendation to by pure basis of people who are close to me or who have access to me. While anyone can send me a message or write me an email, an 18-year-old's not going to write me an email saying, hey, Nikki, my best friend's cousin's aunt said that you're in DeFi and I was wondering if you'd write me a letter. They're going to be like, no, that's stupid and I'd never do that. So I think ultimately it's a conversation of the systematic approach that we have. But I think we as leaders in Panhellenic and as members in Panhellenic, we need to come to the Allah, Jesus, Buddha, whomever you worship moment, that we are not as diverse as we maybe say we are or think we are, and that maybe we need to alter some of our practices to account for some of those biases that we have.
Absolutely. And I know that I've seen even kind of along the same lines, you're asking the same group of people that are the most like you know, how many times do we see on Facebook, right before a recruitment season begins, oh, my daughter is going through recruitment. She needs a letter of recommendation from Chi Omega, Zeta, and Theta Phi Alpha. Do you know what I mean? Like, and then just almost has the expectation that some random woman from either any one of those groups are going to be like, oh, I'll write the letter of recommendation. Write the letter of recommendation. And I'm like, I mean, Theta Phi Alpha doesn't use recommendation letters really, but like, I'm not writing something for somebody that I don't know. Like, Liz would be probably the person that I'd write for because she's a Theta Phi Alpha and I've worked with her. Like, same for Marianne, you know what I mean? Like, it's amazing to me that the concept that's out there is that those letters can come from anyone, from anywhere, who have no idea who these women are as people. Like, Are they welcoming? Are they open? Are they going to be helping, diversify our membership? Whatever that looks like for our organizations, it can vary across the board. So I agree with you, Nikki. I think you're automatically going to go to somebody that looks the most like you, rather than really expanding your horizons even a little bit overall.
Yeah, I also wonder too, like when we talk about the recommendation letter in and of itself, I wonder if it's actually having the letter or what the letter says that's more important. And I tend to think it's more the first. So if she has a letter, or if they have a letter, then they're more apt for XYZ over someone who doesn't have a letter. But when those asks come, I always think to myself, like, that's how you like ask somebody for a coupon, or like, does anyone have a coupon for like XYZ? Not like, will anybody write this letter that may determine the fate of my daughter's next four years? I don't know. I just think it's kind of silly. And whenever people talk about it, or whenever someone, comments on one of those posts, or is like, hey, I don't know about this, it's an automatic snapback of like, well, this is what I'm doing, and she needs this, and she won't get in a sorority because of that. And then I always question afterwards, like, well, does she want to be in a sorority that requires that? And it's just like this cyclical process that I feel like we've gotten ourselves into. And I think it's turned a lot of people off. A lot of people are like, this is almost a joke to me. And no, I will not write your cousin's daughter's second mother's a letter of recommendation because of this.
Right.
And I mean, go ahead, Liz, sorry.
This is probably for a different webinar, but I've been keeping up, and I'm sure all of us have, on the anti-Greek movement. And I work at the University of Delaware, so looking more at their social media posts. And yes, I think that getting rid of legacy policies and letters of reference is a first step in the right direction. But how are we welcoming women or men of color in predominantly white organizations? Yes, we want to diversify and be more inclusive, but when those members join, how are we welcoming them and supporting them through that process? And I don't believe that IFC and Panhellenic are there yet. I think that's a goal of mine this year, is to work on with IFC chapters on how to welcome men of color into their chapter. But I think that needs to be part of the conversation too. But I know that that's another topic, but I wanted to mention that part.
And Liz, I mean, I've been speaking on college campuses now, and working in fraternity and sorority life for a long time, 20 something years. And what I thought I was doing a good job. I thought that I talked about diversity and inclusion a lot. I thought I asked some questions that maybe others didn't ask. I was talking about safety. I was talking about all these things. And what I realized was that I never talked about racism. And I got called on it by a 23-year-old Chi Delta who said, I thought you would be one of the people talking about this, and instead you said nothing. And, so I think that we're all on a journey. And I think that as we start to really delve into, is diversity and inclusion really our objective? Is it equity and access? Because how do we do all of those things? And where do we fall? And, I think with the election coming up, we've really been talking about, and the appointment, of a Supreme Court justice, we've really been talking about safety and what will that look like for our members? And so I agree with you, Liz. I mean, we could, the five of us that are on right now could probably sit and have a major conversation, but I do think that it's different. Diversity is different than inclusion, is different than equity, is different than access, and is different than having conversations about racism. And I think that how we do that is going to determine whether or not we're really going to be safe, equitable organizations where students who have not traditionally felt like they had access have access. And so I personally am still in this, and it's going to be a lifelong journey in understanding what it is we need to do, how I can contribute, and how I can bring others along.
Absolutely. Well said, Marianne.
Thank you.
And I know that, like, for myself, I consider myself overall pretty educated, right? Like I have a PhD, cool, in higher education, but I'm a privileged white woman who has, you know, I come from New York, went to St. John's, where you walk across campus and you can hear, you know, 6 or 7 different languages as you're walking across campus. But did I ever go up to a group of people that was speaking in Hindi and be like, hey, talk to me about this? You know, like one of my best friends is Greek, actual Greek. And I learned a lot from her family and Greek tradition. And that meant so much to me in learning about that, because even my own family is so small that I never really had that opportunity. So when I had the opportunity to get to spend time with a larger family, a Greek population, you know, we laugh at the movie My Big Fat Greek Wedding when he's like, oh, you know, take the Windex, it'll fix everything. And, you know, because he's got a cut, right? But in Greece, the reason they do that is because their hydrogen peroxide is blue. So that's why they think that here in the United States, Windex is going to fix that. Like, I would have never known that had my best friend not been Greek. Do you know what I mean? Like, I learned so much of her culture, and seeing her twin girls grow up and they go to Greek school, and the fact that they speak Greek and like Greek and English together mixed up, like it's amazing to me. All of that. And I still want to learn all of those things. Like I'm not an expert in this area. You know, my privilege and what that looks like, and everything that goes on in a bigger city. I mean, New Orleans is right here. So much has happened in New Orleans, coming from New York. Like so much has gone on in New York. And I think that like really taking the time to continue to educate ourselves, and then being able to educate our women in a way that hopefully we get to a point where our women are more accepting. And I think about some of the students that I work with now who are really into the social justice piece of things and are having some of those harder conversations. And I think that's awesome. But we need to make sure that that's continuing, and it just doesn't stop with them. Like they're handing it down to the next generation of sorority women coming into the fold. Marianne actually mentioned earlier, like, and she and I had a conversation, I feel like it was weeks ago, but like talking about the junior league and how they like, you know, kind of train their people and get them all their information about, you know, this is what you're going to get out of the organization, and this is the investment that you're making. And I wish that we could get to a place where like we're saying to our membership, like, you are going to learn more here about yourself, about the world around you, about the people you're going to come into contact with, what that means, what privilege looks like, what access and equity, like all of those things are different to a lot of different people. And I think that if we could get to that place, I think that's a webinar for another day for sure. But I do agree with that. And I think part of that, unfortunately, like even just the 5 of us on this call right now, like Marianne said, I'm like, it starts with us. We think with some of our older alumni, and I think about my own organization and some of our older alumni that are like, nope, that will not change. Like, I would love to put some of our older alumni in the same room as some of our extremely diverse chapters and see what happens, and just what the conversation looks like overall. And I think that would probably blow some people's minds.
But I do think that, you know, I think that hopefully we're all trying. And I think that that's what you know, I've seen some seasoned women who've really come a long way. And I think as somebody who's in that middle, I'm 55. And so, you know, I think I had a long talk with a Black woman who's a little bit older than me recently. And she said, Marianne, I was not taught she said, I was taught to not talk about racism. So we talk about it in our home, but I was talk about it in public. And so I think generationally, we forget that we ultimately probably have 5 to 6 generations in our sororities right now, right? Expand. And what does that look like? And how do we help one another to see the world through the lens of social justice, just as humans? And so I think as we all move forward in this, I would say one thing as we get off this call is, I know that this call was about reference letters and legacy policies, but it's really a much bigger conversation. And it's about how do we bring women into our organizations who it will really change their lives. I was on a boat the other day, and I was riding along, and there was a lot of political signage. And I thought to myself, where did I learn to think different than where I was raised? And I thought back and I said, it was through the social justice that was taught to me at Loyola University in New Orleans. And it was through my sorority experience and how that's evolved for me. So I hope that as we all, and all of us on this call, and Amanda will close, but we all have the ability to touch lives, and we do it every day. And we have the ability to educate one another as well. So I appreciate her inviting me to be here and spending some time with you all today.
Oh, thank you, Marianne. I will just say that Nikki wrote, I think we also need to note that equity, diversity, and inclusion has been politicized, though not political, and that has and will continue to put a barrier on these conversations in our organizations. I absolutely 100% agree with that. One of the biggest things that I had said always about sorority recruitment and then new member education, right? Like they come right after one another, but in my mind, like you want your newest members to fall in love with not only organization, but the people of the organization, because the people are what make up the organization. I would not be where I am today in life if I did not have the women from Theta Phi Alpha still around for me in a bunch of different areas. I would not be in Louisiana if I hadn't had them. So I definitely agree with that statement. And I wish, my hope for the future is that it becomes less politicized and it just becomes more about people and getting that diversity and equity and access more available to the women that we are welcoming into our organizations. So I thank y'all so much for spending an hour with us. I hope this was helpful and has created some more conversations that we can definitely have. And I would love to continue conversations with all of you for sure. We can certainly invite y'all as co-hosts also for different topics. We can come back together and talk about some of the equity and access issues. But I would love that, just because I think it's such a important topic for right now, considering our world today. So thank y'all so much. I appreciate it. This webinar was recorded, so it will go up on our website. So you know that. I actually forgot to start recording right at first. So I'm gonna miss our introductions, but now you know all of us. So, but the important stuff is there. So thank y'all so much. I really appreciate it. And I hope you have a good rest of your day and week. Thanks, everybody.
Thank y'all.